This is a reading of the second Gorgias, a sequel to Plato's Gorgias, and is part of the collection of dialogues I have written as sequels to Plato's dialogues. Now, this dialogue presents Socrates as contending against Gorgias's argument that nothing exists, and even if anything exists, that couldn't be known, and even if anything exists and can be known, whatever that might be cannot be said or communicated through speech. This portion will cover the argument that nothing exists, the first part of the argument. And Socrates will contend against that position, against the argument as preserved. We have Gorgias's argument, or we have secondhand versions of how he made that point. We have an argument attributed to Gorgias that nothing exists. I present Gorgias as arguing just as the argument is presented as being formulated, and as Socrates arguing against that. This portion also covers the relativism of Protagoras, the other famous sophist. By sort of grouping together almost all the sophists, or looking at them as sort of being part of a movement which leaned upon this sort of shock value that might come with arguing for relativism. As Protagoras famously argued that things are as they appear to each. And Gorgias argued that nothing exists. This covers the argument against Gorgias's claim that nothing exists, and also shows how that is implied or follows from Protagoras's argument also. His argument that things are as they appear to each. And there are no things in and of themselves. There's no objective. And so this is sort of the core of the dialectical exchange in this dialogue. We left off in the previous section at the end of the sort of setting and the events leading up to Socrates' argument with Gorgias. So I'll pick up there. Callias, you two, Socrates and Phaedrus, the rest of us want in on your conversation. For now that we are few, I think the sort of discussion you are having would be more appropriate. And as you, Socrates, seem to be consoling Phaedrus, why do you not speak so that the rest of us can hear? Or rather, why do you not put your questions to Gorgias here? I don't think he should be offended that he is being contended against. For he argued for a position which nobody here, nobody even on the face of the wide earth, believed to be true. And beyond that, Gorgias claims part of his expertise to be answering questions, and he professes to answer all questions which any may ask. Socrates. I have no objections, Callias, if Gorgias here consents to answer my questions. So what do you say, Gorgias? While we were a great multitude and you were making your exhibition, although I could not entirely keep up with what you were saying, it would have been inappropriate to hinder your presentation with questions. But now, since we are, as Callias says, few, the sort of discussion which proceeds by question and answer would be appropriate. Gorgias. I have no objection, Socrates. It would be strange if I, who profess to answer any question posed to me, should now refuse to answer you, especially after giving a speech in defense of a most unusual and difficult position. Callias. Oh, how delightful. I do think that the rest of us would like to hear this topic discussed at greater length. Nor were we able to hear your discussion with Phaedrus, Socrates. So do begin again and set your questions to Gorgias without assuming that we are aware of anything which you might have established with Phaedrus. Socrates. I think there is something, Gorgias, which we might discuss first, that should make our discourse seem less like a contest between disputants than a shared inquiry. I mean to say that I am stricken with wonder at how similar your argument is with that of Protagoras. When we were listening to your exhibition, I did not yet have this thought, but as I have begun to reflect on the matter, I noticed the correspondence. Gorgias. In what way? What do you mean? Socrates. I will tell you. Now, I don't mean to imply that you in any way copied or imitated his doctrine, for you have exhibited great ingenuity in composing a most difficult argument to make. And I further wonder if you meant in all this to exhibit your talent in argument and speech making, since you chose to argue for a seemingly impossible position. For I have heard that you at other times have made speeches in defense of the most difficult things to argue for, and that you take that sort of challenge up as a rhetorical exercise. Gorgias. What is the difference to you if I defend a view that is not necessarily mine, or if I really hold the view myself? Socrates. That makes no difference to me. Of course, if I were ill and someone gave me advice about how my health might be restored, in that case, I would most definitely want to know who the speaker is and if he is a medical physician or not, and if he believes what he prescribes before listening to him. However, there is no harm in treating the argument as separate from your belief. Yet you must not deceive me and tell me you agree when you do not, regarding my questions. Gorgias. I am answering in earnest. Now, what is this you say about the similarity of my argument with those of Protagoras? Socrates. I mean that he would likely agree with your whole thesis, him more so than any other of our modern contemporaries. First, that nothing exists, and after that, that even if anything exists, it couldn't be known, and also that if anything exists and can be known, it can't be said. Gorgias. Do you think so? Socrates. I practically know so. For that all follows from his own arguments. You are aware, are you not, with the statement that things are only as they appear to each. You are aware, are you not, with the statement that things only are as they appear to each individual, that things are to you as they appear to you, and things are to me as they appear to me. Gorgias. Yes, of course. Socrates. Well, I understand that there is no outward similarity between that and what you have said. However, Each of the points of your argument follow from that claim, which seems to mask the same position about nothing existing, as well as the inability of knowledge and the inability of speech. Whereas you quite boldly pronounce what he masks behind his seemingly less contentious claim. And once again, I don't intend to imply that you learned any of these things from him or that you are his student or disciple. For I know you are colleagues, and if there is any that is his equal, it is you. However, I get a feeling that I had years and years ago. May I explain? Gorgias, you may. Socrates. You are aware that Parmenides came to Athens with Zeno during the Great Panathenea. I am referring to a time when most of the youth present were not yet born. Gorgias, I have heard. Socrates. Well, they came to Athens to present the writings of Zeno, and he read them to us much like you just read your argument on non-being. Parmenides was an old man by then, at least 65, and I was a very young man, probably as young as any of the youths present here. Zeno was around 40 years old, but he had composed the work as a young man in the spirit of contention that is common to men at that age. Anyways, when I had heard Zeno read his writings, I asked him if he wasn't saying the same thing as Parmenides, but the other way around. For Parmenides had argued that everything is only one, and had received much criticism from many saying that everything couldn't be just one. So in response, and in order to defend his master, Zeno composed a series of arguments against the possibility that things are many, offering great difficulties to Parmenides' opponents, as if taking the offense instead of the defense. And I wasn't slighting Zeno in any way, as that was the natural course for him to take. However, I get the sense that you are making a similar maneuver in this work in correspondence with Protagoras. Although I realize you are not his disciple, but his colleague. I also get the sense that your thesis is like one wing of an attack in accordance with an opposing wing of the thesis of Protagoras. Wherefore I'm beginning to be careful not to be flanked by his arguments, which could easily blindside me, since they might be arranged in support of your own. Gorgias. I will understand the comparison if you tell me how the theories of Protagoras result in the claims I have made. That I will tell you now was not my intention. This is not an attempt to defend his doctrines. However, you are right to compare us in other respects. Our schools, as opposed to the Eleatics or any others, don't profess to teach or even to defend any particular doctrine for the most part. We both rather provide our disciples with the skills required to be effective at persuasion in public affairs. Socrates. There is Protagoras' claim that things only are as they appear to each, as we acknowledged. Now, that is, I think, a more palatable way of making a claim that implies the bolder claims that you have made today, which again, I should say, exhibits your talent in making an argument for something that is difficult to defend and showcases your rhetorical skill without question. Gorgias. Yes, I pride myself in being able to make the weaker argument appear stronger. For what else could prove competency in argument and persuasion than successfully defending the most difficult position? Socrates. And your rhetorical exhibition made that clear. I could tell by the response of the audience that almost everyone was persuaded. So what is there to worry about some one person such as I taking the argument as abstract and separate from the composer and examining its soundness? Gorgias, go right ahead as you have begun. Now, about the correspondence with Protagoras. Socrates. Well, things often appear differently, even opposite and contrary to one person as they do to another. Is that not obvious to all? Gorgias, that is. Socrates. Is that not what Protagoras is referring to when he says that things are as they appear to each? Gorgias, that must be what he's referring to. Socrates, for example, that the same wind might appear cold to someone that is wet and warm to someone that is dry. Gorgias, yes. Socrates, and if we or they were to ask Protagoras, is the wind itself warm or cold? Or is the wind neither warm nor cold itself? What would he say? Gorgias, I suppose he would say that the wind is neither warm nor cold in and of itself. Socrates, but his meaning is that both are right, both the one who thinks the wind is cold and the other who thinks the wind is warm. Gorgias, his meaning is that they both are right. Socrates, but he would also say that the wind is neither cold nor warm in and of itself. Gorgias, he would also say that. Socrates, and that they are both right, that the wind appears to each of them such. Gorgias, yes. Socrates, then the wind itself isn't the criterion of their judgment, but the only standard is the appearance of the wind, which is different to each. Gorgias, he would agree to that too. Socrates, then does he not do away with any truth about the wind itself apart from its appearance to each? Gorgias, the truth for him is not about the wind itself, but that the wind appears such and such to someone or other. Socrates, and neither are more right or more wrong than any other. Gorgias, that too. Socrates, and the same goes for health and disease. Wouldn't he say that none are qualified more than any others to determine if someone is healthy or diseased? Gorgias, he would. Socrates, and navigating a ship, would any be more right or wrong about the season to sail and the winds and course of navigation? Gorgias, I suppose not. Socrates, but those things would all be as they appear to each. Gorgias, such is his claim. Socrates, and only as they appear to each. Gorgias, and only as they appear to each. Socrates, and having no essence of their own outside of how they appear. Gorgias, I cannot say. Socrates, well, you can say that they appear opposite and contrary to different people, can you not? Gorgias, yes. Socrates, and could things themselves really be contrary to themselves? Gorgias, that would be quite absurd. Socrates, but they do appear opposite and contrary to different people at the same time, right? Gorgias, that is sure. Socrates, and Protagoras says that they are as they appear to each. Gorgias, he says that. Socrates, but they themselves couldn't be contrary to themselves. Gorgias, no. Socrates, then one of two things results. Either things can't be as they appear to each, or Protagoras means that things themselves don't exist apart from appearance. Or in other words, that things have no essential nature themselves, that there is nothing outside of appearances. Gorgias, I assume his meaning is the latter, that things don't exist apart from how they appear. Socrates, so you see, Protagoras would likely agree with your first claim, that nothing exists. Gorgias, in a rather shrouded way, yes. Socrates, and with your second claim too. For he says there is none that are more right than any others and none that are more wrong about anything, and that no perspective is more true than any other, nor any more false. Gorgias. That is at least implied in what he says, yes. Socrates. Neither are there qualified experts in any field under that hypothesis. Gorgias. I suppose not. Socrates. Then does he not do away with knowledge, even though he seems to say that each is right about how things appear to him? Gorgias. In that sense, yes. Socrates. Well, he at least says that things themselves can't be known, that the essence of things outside of appearances can't be known, doesn't he? Gorgias. That much is clear. Socrates. Then he, as much as anyone else, agrees with your second claim, that even if things existed, they couldn't be known. Gorgias. He seems to imply that. Socrates. And if things have no self-nature or essence of their own outside of how they appear, and they appear differently to each, and none are more right or wrong about either things themselves or how they appear, then how could they possibly even speak about things? I dare say that they couldn't even speak of how things appear. Gorgias. They couldn't. Socrates. For they couldn't possibly agree about the meaning of words, as the meaning of words would be as they appear to each. And there would be no right nor wrong interpretation of a word's meaning, nor correct or incorrect use. And besides that, and beyond that, there would be nothing for any word to signify, as while each is in a sort of facade world of his own, there would be no agreement about anything. Gorgias. That is right. Socrates. Then he would agree with your final statement as well. And I will venture to say that the reverse order of the argument carries greater momentum. What I mean is this. If nothing is, surely nothing can be known. And if nothing is or can be known, surely nothing can be said about anything. That cannot be contended against except from the top, by refuting the claimed hypothesis that nothing exists. However, you, and quite boldly as you are apt, say that even if something exists, it cannot be known. And even if something exists and can be known, it cannot be said. Whereas I believe the momentum is lost with each subsequent admission. And the force of the argument arranged as I just stated grows in momentum with each stage, so long as the hypothesis holds. That, however, we have yet to see. Yet your arrangement of the thesis is not surprising if you are trying to exhibit the most difficult argument to defend a position that none other could uphold, as that would make for a most impressive display of your persuasive ability, and as that is what you teach your pupils. Gorgias. In any case, you have illustrated very well how the implications of Protagoras' claim that things are as they appear to each is in agreement with my own argument. Socrates. Socrates. I might say also that the doctrines of Heraclitus, and the Ephesians come to similar points. Gorgias. In what way? Socrates. You are aware of their doctrine that everything is in motion, or also that everything is becoming, are you not? Gorgias. Yes, I am aware of their doctrines. Socrates. I don't think this will be an unnecessary divergence, for we will be better off interpreting your theory if we include those who agree with you in all but appearance, or in all but particulars. Gorgias. Then go on. I would like to hear about those who are arrayed on my side. Socrates. They would be a most troublesome group if they were instead arrayed against you. I will try to explain. They say that everything is in motion, do they not? Gorgias, they do. Socrates. And by that, they mean that nothing is at rest. Gorgias, that is clear. Socrates. And that nothing is stationary. Gorgias, yes. Socrates. Now, by motion, do they only mean motion in place? Or do they also include alteration and change? Gorgias, they include alteration and change, for they often say that everything is changing. Socrates, are those not the two kinds of motion, motion in place and alteration or change? Gorgias, yes. Socrates, and if some things are moving in place, but are not changing in quality or size or essence, and other things are being altered, but are stationary, would they be right to say that everything is in motion in that sort of wholesale fashion? Or would things equally be at rest? Gorgias. Things would be at rest in one sense and in motion in another sense. Socrates. So they must mean that everything is in all kinds of motion at once. Gorgias. They must. Socrates. Now, by everything is changing, do they not mean that nothing remains the same? Gorgias. They mean just that. Socrates. And they regard something that changes in any way as becoming different. Gorgias. As do all. Socrates. Then something that changes in any way, they would say, becomes different than it is. Gorgias. And rightly so. Socrates. And something that becomes different than it is becomes what it is not. Gorgias. Becomes what it is not. Yes. Socrates. And so becoming what it is not must, and so becoming what it is not must also cease to be what it is. Gorgias. Yes. Socrates. So again, according to them, something that changes in any way, either by altering in quality or size or by moving in place, becomes different than it is, and so becomes what it is not, and ceases to be what it is. Gorgias, precisely. Socrates. Now, since they say that everything is changing, and since they mean by something changing that it becoming different than it is, becomes what it is not, and ceases to be what it is, if we really push them on this point, they would say that nothing remains any one thing for any span of time. Similarly, they would refuse to say that anything can be any one thing, since anything we designate as something is always becoming something else. And I have even heard some of their adherents say just that something cannot be any one thing if it is always becoming something else. Gorgias, they would. And I am not surprised that you have heard them venture to say that. Socrates, but could something that is always in a process of changing into something else, and that never remains any one indistinct thing ever, be thought again? Could something that is always in a process of changing into something else, and that never remains any one indistinct thing, ever be thought of as having a fixed and determinate essence? Gorgias, something in that condition could not have any fixed essence, no, but would be wholly indeterminate, indefinite, and variable. Socrates, and since, according to them, everything is always being continuously changed, such as not to remain any one thing for any span of time, don't they have to abandon the words such, is, are, it, they, and the like? Gorgias, that is right. They really avoid such terminology when possible. Socrates. Do they not then share the position with you that nothing really exists? For that is what they mean and what they say when they claim that everything is becoming and nothing is. Gorgias. They agree with me on that, yes. Socrates. You are aware of that distinction between being and becoming? Gorgias. I am. Socrates. And that what is implied when they say that everything is becoming is that nothing really exists? Gorgias. Yes. Socrates. And could there be any knowledge of anything if everything is always changing from what it is into something else and nothing remains the same as it is? Gorgias. There could not. Socrates. For as soon as we have come to know anything, it will have become to cease to be that and change into something else. Gorgias. That is exactly why. Socrates. And could words indicate anything if everything is always changing into something else? Gorgias. No. We already pointed out that they abandon the use of substantive words and try to restrict themselves to verbs and indicators of change and motion. Socrates. Then don't you see that they agree with each of your three claims? Gorgias. Yes. Socrates. I point this out because even if you said everything is becoming, or everything is changing, or everything is in motion, and nothing remains the same, and nothing is stationary, you could still uphold your thesis that nothing is, that nothing can be known, and that nothing can be said. Gorgias, that has become clear. Socrates, perhaps we should have that settled first, for I anticipate that you might want to resort to that position in defense of your thesis if you should so be required. Callias. Callicles. But Socrates, Gorgias's argument included a refutation of that very position. It would be absurd if he were to adapt his argument in support of the position that holds that everything is coming to be, after having already made the argument that since as being must have either come to be or be ungenerated, and being can neither have come to be nor be ungenerated, being cannot exist. And in addition, neither of you hold that being came to be. And if you were to argue that being is ungenerated and he were to oppose you from there, he would be betraying his position that nothing exists, at least at face value. And at the very least, the opposing sides of the argument would become obscure. Socrates. O Callicles. O Callicles. I do not think Gorgias wants to adjust his argument in support of the claim that being came to be. Neither does he have to. I only point out that the authors of the doctrine of flux are in agreement with him, and that when we begin to inquire into whether or not anything can be known or said, there might be a great deal of difficulty keeping the theories of Heraclitus from rising to the surface. Callicles. Well, you should contend with the argument as he presented it and show that the difficulties he pointed out are not involved in either the claim that being is ungenerated or that being has came to be. For as yet, Gorgias is unconvinced of your previous argument with Phaedrus that something must exist. Socrates. Might we then have the argument repeated? For neither did Gorgias wait for my admission after each premise, nor was I able to follow every step in his unbroken reading of the argument. Callicles. That should be done. Socrates. And will you, Callicles, repeat the argument for us, or shall we plead for Gorgias himself to do it? Callicles. That should be the task of Gorgias himself, as that is not something that I am able to do, and as I am but a listener. And your refuting me would not mean anything for the validity of his argument. Socrates. How then, Gorgias, did the argument go? For if you should not only want to impress us, which indeed you have, but should also want to convince us, as it seems to me, you will yourself want to repeat at least the relevant part of the argument. Gorgias. I gladly consent to repeat the argument. If being exists, it must have either come to be or be ungenerated, mustn't it? Socrates. There is no alternative. Gorgias. But first of all, being cannot have come to be, for observe. What has come to be must have come to be from being or from non-being. Or is there any alternative? Socrates. There is not. Gorgias. But no one would say that being came to be from non-being, for something can't come to be from nothing. Socrates. Heavens no. Gorgias. Neither, however, could being come to be from being, for in that case, being would not have come to be, if whatever has come to be couldn't have existed before coming to be. And also in that case, being would undergo a change. And just as if non-being were to come to be from non-being, it would no longer be non-being. So also if being were to come to be from being, means that being would undergo a change and would no longer be being. Socrates. Neither could being come to be from being. Gorgias. But if being could not have come to be from being or from non-being, then being could not have come to be. Socrates. It could not have. Gorgias. Neither, however, could being be ungenerated. Socrates. That is a point I wish to contend against. Gorgias. Then do make your stand. Socrates. And you make your advance. Gorgias. If being is ungenerated, then it didn't come to be. Or is that not what we mean by ungenerated? Socrates. That is what we mean. Gorgias. But what didn't come to be couldn't have had a beginning, could it? Socrates. It couldn't have had a beginning. No. Gorgias. Then being, if it is ungenerated, has no beginning. Socrates. It has not. Gorgias. But a beginning is a limit of what is the beginning of, or is something that has come to be not limited by its beginning. Socrates. A beginning is a limit. Yes. Gorgias. Then if being has no beginning, and a beginning is a limit, it must be unlimited, mustn't it? Socrates. It must be. Gorgias. And is not what is unlimited infinite? Socrates. Yes, infinite. Gorgias. But could what is infinite be in any place? Socrates. Oh, how I foresee the crashing weight of the argument if I am not to get a footing here. Gorgias. Then here is where you will cease to permit my advance and take your stand. Socrates. Would that I were able not just to make an attempt, but to disarm that ingenious device you have resorted to. The amount of time that Agamemnon persisted to besiege Troy is but a fraction of the time I persisted to trying to solve that enigmatic riddle. Gorgias. Do make an attempt then, for what other preparation could you hope to acquire? Socrates. You can be assured that I will, Gorgias. Gorgias. You are right to say that mighty is the collapsing weight of the argument from here. For observe, if anything that is must be in some place, and what is nowhere is nothing, then if what is infinite cannot be in any place, and being is infinite, then being is nothing. Socrates, that would follow. However, before dealing with this last proposition, that whatever is must be in some place, I should like something clarified. We will inevitably have to return afterwards to the claim that what is not in anything and is nowhere is nothing. What would you like clarified, Gorgias? What would you like clarified? Socrates, if being is ungenerated and without a beginning in time, mustn't being be limitless in respect of time and not in respect of magnitude? Or does the limited and infinite have those differing senses? Infinite in respect of time, an infinite magnitude, and an infinite multitude. Gorgias, there are those different senses of infinity, yes. Socrates, then what should rather follow from the argument is that if being is without a beginning in time, and so is unlimited, then it could not be in time. That is, instead of saying that if being is unlimited, then it could not be in any place. Gorgias, I don't see why that should not be permitted. Nor, however, do I think that will alter the argument. Socrates, neither do I wish to avoid that Gorgian-like premise that whatever is anything must be in something else, lest it resurface unawares to me elsewhere. Gorgias, then try the argument for a throw. Socrates, first, we should have to be on the lookout that we are not speaking with obscurity. Gorgias, and how should that be prevented? Socrates, there is an obscurity about place and about being in something that might be dispelled. Gorgias, in what way? Socrates, by specifying about the following. When we say that something is in a place or that something is in something else, do we mean anything other than that it is contained in what it is in? Gorgias, that is quite surely what we mean. Socrates, and that what is contained is in what it is contained by? Gorgias, without question. Socrates, and the contained is contained by the container? Gorgias, precisely. Socrates, and likewise, the container contains the contained? Gorgias, indeed. Socrates, now, according to this Gorgon or Fury-like premise, what is contained is given precedence over what it is contained by. For I assume that you will grant that to say that anything that is must be in some place is the same as saying that whatever is must be contained by something. But the proposition does not read that anything that is must contain something. Gorgias, that is right. Socrates, but should that be so? Or would you say with me that if the container, but should that be so? Or would you say with me that if the contained is taken away, the container remains? Yet if the container is taken away, there cannot be contained. Or in other words, there can be a container without anything contained, but there cannot be anything contained without a container. I should rephrase that to specify that the container remains when the containts are disposed or moved. Gorgias. I should rather agree. Socrates. Then, if there can be a container without anything contained, but there cannot be anything contained without a container, the demand should not be made that if a container is, then it should be contained by something, nor that if a place is, then it should have to be somewhere. Gorgias. And yet, Socrates, I cannot distance myself from the assertion that if something is, then it must be somewhere, and that anything that is nowhere is nothing. Socrates. You have heard that some of the mathematicians, albeit some of the less sophisticated of them, define unity as a point without place. Have you not? Gorgias. I have. Socrates. Now, I am sure that the author of that ingenious device, I mean the premise that anything that is must be somewhere, would not allow that something without magnitude like a point could be anything, since his other armament is a supposition that anything that when added or subtracted from another doesn't result in increase or decrease doesn't exist. Nor should I expect that to be something that you ought to immediately allow. However, that is one instance of something that is commonly admitted to exist without place. Yet we should rather turn elsewhere for a definite solution to this problem. Gorgias. That should not prove decisive in the scope of this argument. Where ought we to turn? Socrates. Well, we are yet to reach a decisive agreement about what is unlimited, whether that, if admitted to not be anywhere, or more appropriately, if admitted not to be in time, would thereby not exist. Although we are halfway to a definite solution about whether anything that is must be somewhere, we might make somewhat of a fresh start without abandoning our dilemma about place by considering the same question in the context of the limited and the unlimited, rather than as we were of the contained and the container. Gorgias. I see how that sort of maneuver might again prevent obscurity, since the terms are rather analogous. Socrates. I would hope so. Beware, however, lest we be releasing the Titans from Tartarus. Or are there any more formidable concepts than the limited and the unlimited, the finite and the infinite, the definite and the indefinite, and all their host? Gorgias. That is, if we already have it. Socrates. Well said, Gorgias. We are as yet already in their midst. Gorgias. And may this then not amass confusion nor end undecidedly. Socrates. Let us then begin with the limited and the unlimited. Now, perhaps because the infinite cannot be traversed, neither by thought nor by motion, if not, as I think is the case, for some other reason. The greatest misunderstanding, more so than even confusion, has arisen regarding their meaning and application. I say that because I often hear the many applying them in contrary ways to contrary things. And sometimes I think they are the most assured of principles, while at other times I hardly know what they mean. Gorgias. Yes, they are a source of great confusion, and we ought to take caution as you heed. Socrates. Neither should we forget that we are inquiring after the unlimited of whether being, if ungenerated and unlimited, and so not in time, would, by not being in something, not exist. . Gorgias. That has not slipped my mind. Socrates, good. Now, I suggest that of the pair, we should take first the limited, for that will, I think, be less difficult to comprehend. And from there, we'll be well disposed to grasp the unlimited. Gorgias, that seems like the natural order to take them. Socrates, then look closely. What is limited has a limit. Is that right? Gorgias, undoubtedly. Socrates, and is this how things are for the limited? Would you say with me that the limited is limited by a limit? Gorgias, that cannot be denied. Socrates, and that a limit is the limit of the limited, and that a limit is the limit of the limited? Gorgias, assuredly. Socrates, just as we said that the contained is contained by a container, and a container contains the contained. Gorgias, just so. Socrates, before we were asking if we are compelled to accept the premise that states that anything that is has to be somewhere and in something. And if likewise anything, and before we were asking if we are compelled to accept the premise that states that anything that is has to be somewhere and in something, and if likewise anywhere something is must also be somewhere and in something, and that too must be in something else, and so on. Gorgias, that was the problem, or rather the paradox, the argument rested on. Socrates, and after the same manner, we agreed, and after the same manner, we agreed that if that were so, then the same thing should apply to the contained and what contains it, such that if anything that is has to be contained by something, since that is the same as being in something, the container too, if that is, must also be contained by something else, which must also be contained by something else ad infinitum. Gorgias, and there is no question that the two cases are analogous. Socrates, and we came to the agreement that at least what is contained cannot exist without what it is contained by. And also that what contains, that is the container, can in fact exist without what it contains. Gorgias, and from there, I believe we reached a standstill. Socrates, let us then advance from there in a similar fashion, this time in terms of the limited and the limit. Gorgias, what would be an analogous method of inquiry? Socrates, there are two things we should ask. First, whether if, as we say that what is limited must be limited by a limit, so also a limit must be limited by yet something else. And after that, whether a limit can exist without what is limited, yet what is limited cannot exist without a limit, or not. Gorgias, yes, that seems to be the same course of inquiry. Socrates, so to begin, we say that surfaces are the limits of bodies, or in other words, bodies are limited by surfaces, do we not? Gorgias, we do. Socrates, but surfaces, being the limits of bodies, are themselves limited by yet something else, are they not? Gorgias, indeed they are. Socrates, And what is it that surfaces are limited by? Or what are the limits of surfaces? Gorgias, lines. Socrates. And we might ask the same thing about lines, whether they, although being the limits of surfaces, are yet themselves limited by something else. Gorgias. That would be the appropriate step. Socrates. And are lines limited by something different than lines? Gorgias. Yes, lines are limited by points. Socrates. That is, points are the limits of lines? Gorgias. Yes. But are Socrates, but are points, being the limits of lines, limited by yet something else? Gorgias. The question is but absurd. For what magnitude or interval is there within a single point to limit? And what is there of a point to be contained in or between anything else? Socrates. Then a limit does not have to itself have a limit in something else. Gorgias. By the looks of the argument, no. Socrates. Then also, what is unlimited is the limit of the limited. Or in other words, what is the limit of the limited is what is unlimited. Has that not become evident? Gorgias. Well, Socrates, I cannot tell if you have resolved a paradox or if you have set a contradiction in place of an impassable passageway. I am, however, dissatisfied with admitting that a point, being without interval or magnitude, is unlimited. Socrates. Then stepping back, I should ask you to consider if you can have any doubt that the limits of a body are surfaces. Again, then stepping back, I should ask you to consider if you have any doubt that the limits of a body are surfaces. Gorgias. I am much more comfortable admitting that surfaces are the limits of bodies. Socrates. But if anything that is has to be somewhere and has to be in some place, such that the place anything is must itself be in yet some other place, if the place is to exist, and that in some other ad infinitum. If in that case we must finally come to something that can only be said to be in the whole cosmos. Gorgias. Yes, and where the argument goes is the cosmos. Or what is the cosmos in? Or better yet, what is the whole in? Socrates. Well, the cosmos is a body, is it not? Gorgias. A body, yes. Socrates. But is Socrates. But is what something is in? But is what something is in? Hold on. Socrates. But is what something is in what it is limited by? Or are the limits of something not the place in which it is? Gorgias. I suppose those are congruent, the place and the limit. Socrates. But the limits of a body are surfaces? Gorgias. Surfaces, yes. Socrates. And the whole is a sphere? Indeed. Gorgias. Indeed. Socrates. Yet a sphere, being a body, is limited by a single surface? Gorgias. By a single surface. Socrates. A single surface, A single spherical surface, then, is the limit of the whole cosmos? Gorgias, yes. Socrates. And a body is in what it is limited by? Gorgias. Again, yes. Socrates. Then what the cosmos or the whole is in is a spherical surface? Gorgias. That can be said. What, however, is the spherical surface of the cosmos in? Socrates. Well, is that not the same as asking what the limits of the surface of that sphere are? Is that not the same as asking what the limits of the surface of that sphere are? Gorgias. Quite the same. Socrates. Now, the only limits of a surface are lines, are they not? Gorgias. Yes. Socrates. But whichever way we turn the surface of a sphere, we never reach a line limiting the surface, nor do we find any edge or boundary. Gorgias. No, we do not. Socrates. Then the surface of a sphere is without limits. For if the surface of a sphere, being the limit of the sphere, were to be limited by something else, that would have to be lines, as all other surfaces are limited by lines. But whichever way we go around the sphere, a spherical surface, we never reach a bounding line nor an edge. So we cannot say that the surface of a sphere has a limit. Gorgias. That follows according to the argument, at least. Socrates. And as we found before, that the points which are the limits of lines are not themselves limited by anything else. So now the surface, which is the limit of a sphere, is not limited by anything else. For there is no line that forms the boundary of a spherical surface. Although you complained before of my account that points, although without magnitude, are unlimited, being the limits of lines but not being limited by anything else. In this case, I present you with something that does have magnitude, a surface, which is not limited by any line nor by anything else. And if that is so, we cannot ask what the surface of the sphere of the fixed stars is, nor what its limits are. But although we can say that the whole cosmos, including the other heavenly spheres, are within and have as their limit the surface of the sphere which carries around the fixed stars, that spherical surface is not limited nor bounded by any line, but is unlimited and cannot be said to be within anything else. Gorgias. Before you asked me to admit that the limits of lines, that is points, being entirely without magnitude or interval, are unlimited. Now you ask me to agree with you to what? That the surface encompassing as a limit the spherical cosmos, although not extending outward, is without limit and unlimited. Again, Gorgias. Before you asked me to admit that the limits of lines, that is points, being entirely without magnitude or interval, are unlimited. Now you ask me to agree with you to what? That the surface encompassing as a limit the spherical cosmos, although not extending outward, is without limit and unlimited. Socrates. The argument only demands that what is unlimited can be the limit of others. As naturally, if there are some things that are limited, and they are limited by others, which are the limits of them, then we ought to look for what is without a limit in those which are themselves limits of others. Gorgias. You speak of something counterintuitive to how our forebears spoke of these matters. For everywhere we hear of their proclamations that bodies limit each other, and that if one magnitude is limited by another, that other is also limited by it. Not that a magnitude is limited by something of a different order, rather than by something of the same order of magnitude. For the men of old would say things like, the air is limited by the earth and the earth by the air, meaning that they share a common boundary and limit each other. Socrates, quite so. For if, as they say, the limit of a body is another body, that also will be limited by what it is the limit of. Yet, if a body is limited by surfaces, surfaces won't then be limited reciprocally. Yet, if a body is limited by surfaces, surfaces won't then be limited reciprocally by the body they limit, nor will the surfaces be limited by other surfaces, but by lines. Gorgias. And what bearing does this have on the argument? Socrates. We were in the midst of that grueling proposition that anything that is has to be somewhere. The problem, I remind you, is that if that is true, then the same thing applies to the place, which will then also have to be in something else, and that in yet some other. But if, as place is congruent with the limit of what is limited, and to the container of the contained, and the limit of what is limited doesn't itself have to be limited by something else, then neither does place have to be in something else. Nor does what is a limit that is itself unlimited have to be in some place. Callicles. Your idea of the limit as being itself without limit, Socrates, is indeed compelling, yet difficult for us to accept. As we had been thinking of something being without a limit as a boundless magnitude, or an endless successive series. Nor are we ready to admit of what something is limited by, nor are we ready to admit of what something is limited by as not reciprocally being limited by what it limits. The argument, I think, is inconclusive. Gorgias. Callicles speaks very much to my mind, Socrates. I must say that I am similarly reserved as to accepting that what is a limit of something shouldn't also have a limit in something else, or shouldn't be limited by what it limits or by anything else. Socrates. Well, I am deeply compelled to thank Callicles here for reminding me about the issue of completion and conclusiveness. When just now referring to the argument as inconclusive, you, Callicles, reminded me of something which I should have been able to recollect on my own, something which is very much to the point of this idea of the limit of others being itself without limit in anything else. So tell me, Callicles, would not something be lacking from the argument if it were to continue in an endless series of successive steps without ever reaching a conclusive end? Callicles. It would be unresolved and terribly lacking, yes. Socrates. And something like that would be wanting of completion? Callicles. Of completion, yes. Socrates. And imperfect? Or could an endless series ever reach perfection? Callicles. And imperfect. Socrates. Is not the infinite, if thought of as an endless series, then also always lacking completion and perfection. Callicles. Well, in that sense, you might say so. Socrates. And would you say that what isn't lacking any part is a whole that what isn't lacking any part is a whole? Callicles, I would say that, yes. Socrates, but the infinite always has some part outside of Callicles. Well, what can always increase is always becoming more. Socrates, but can the infinite ever reach and encompass all? Or would that make it a fixed finite quantity? Callicles, the infinite can always be more. Socrates, but at every successive step of an unending increasing series, at every successive step of an unending increasing series, whatever multitude the infinite encompasses becomes finite. Is that right? Callicles, but the successive series isn't finite. Socrates, then there is always something left over, but in all is never reached. Callicles, no, for like you said, all would be made to be fixed and finite. Socrates, neither is the infinite a whole, or every increasing multitude, every whole that is reached and encompassed becomes finite, and the whole of every increasing multitude becomes a part of the next, but no whole is reached in an infinite series that doesn't become part of another. In Callicles, even if a whole were reached and encompassed that weren't to become a part of another greater multitude, it would be finite, being a multiple of finite quantities. But the infinite, as I say, is never whole and is always lacking some part, never encompassing all. Callicles, what a peculiar thing to say, that the infinite is lacking anything. Socrates, but when we talk about the infinite as an endless series, that is what we must say. Callicles, and what, on the other hand, was that you were saying? That the limit is unlimited and infinite, rather than that which never reaches an end or limit? Socrates, that was my claim. Callicles, is that not equally absurd? Socrates, perhaps I should illustrate what I have reference to when speaking about the limited and the limit and the unlimited. Perhaps I should illustrate what I have reference to when speaking about the limited and the limit and the unlimited in this way. There are some things that we would never choose to do for their own sake. There are some things that we would never choose to do for their own sake, but which we willingly choose to do for the sake of something else. Is there not? Callicles, there are. Socrates, and we might take up some task in order to do something else, neither of which we would choose to do for their own sake, so that yet some other, which can't be resulted without the others, may be secured. Callicles, yes. Socrates, and a truly endless series of tasks, one that for the sake of one thing we have to do something else, and in order to do that we have to complete some other, and before that another. An endless series like that would be futile and pointless without reaching that for the sake of which we began. Would it not? Callicles, that would indeed be futile and unfulfilling. Socrates, and we call that for the sake of which something is done an end? Callicles, yes, an end. Socrates, and that for the sake of which we do something, isn't chosen for the sake of the means, but for the sake of itself, while the means isn't chosen for the sake of itself, but only for the sake of the end. Callicles, Yes, Socrates. But the end isn't pursued for the sake of anything else? Callicles, no. Socrates. And that for the sake of which we do something is the end? Callicles, as we agreed. Socrates. Then if the end isn't pursued for the sake of anything else, the end is itself without an end, or is endless. Is that right? Callicles. I suppose so. But Socrates, again, you offer an infinite that is not an unlimited continuation, but a termination. Socrates, and you, Callias, would have something indeterminate and indefinite in favor of what is determinate and definite. For if the infinite is anything valuable, then it is as I say. But if the infinite is the same as the indefinite and indeterminate, and the finite is the same as the definite and determinate, then the infinite, I say, is less than invaluable. And fear not that the end for the sake of which we willingly endure pains and all manners of difficulty should turn out not to be perpetual and continual. For observe that whatever those things are which a person loves, they can't get enough of. As Gorgias and I never cease to indulge in knowledge and dialectic, and others in tragedies and music, and others in all sorts of things. Yet their enduring difficulties for the sake of whatever they love is limited, as they only choose to take pains for the sake of those other things. But those other things, for the sake of which they take pains, they endlessly transfix upon so far as they are not prevented. Callicles. Well, Socrates, I must say that I am gladdened to hear that this termination of other things is not only a termination and is not itself terminated. Socrates. The point, Callicles, is that we find what is endless in what is the end of other things, or that for the sake of which they are done. The point, Callicles, is that we find what is endless in what is the end of other things, or that for the sake of which they are done. Or again, that we find what is unlimited and limitless in the limit of what is limited. Callicles. The distinction is more agreeable regarding things for the sake of which we choose to do other things, which we otherwise would never choose to do. Much more so than your account of the limits of lines, that is, points being themselves without limits and therefore unlimited. Socrates, but I spoke of the limits of lines being themselves without limits and unlimited, with much the same thing in mind. Regardless, we shall have to see if Gorgias is willing to accept this account of something endless being the end for the sake of which we endure a sequence of actions. Gorgias. That appeals to me a great deal more than your account of the limits of lines as unlimited and yet without magnitude. But how does all this bear on the argument? Was this digression not geared towards the premise that something infinite or unlimited cannot be in anything or in any place? Socrates. Well, the premise tied to that, yes, according to which anything that is has to be in something and somewhere, and that whatever is nowhere is nothing. Gorgias. I recall. Socrates. We have since agreed that the limits of other things may themselves be without limits, and so be unlimited, have we not? Gorgias, we have. Socrates, now the place of anything is the limit of what it contains. Gorgias, quite so. Socrates, and these are congruent. The place and the limit, as well as, I should say, the container. For what is in any place is contained and limited therein as if by a limit. Gorgias, that is agreeable enough. Socrates, but the limit, we said, of what is limited doesn't itself have to have a limit, just as the end for the sake of which otherwise disagreeable actions are chosen and performed may be itself without end and not be for the sake of anything else. Gorgias, that was said. Socrates, then neither can we say that the container of something contained has to be contained by some yet other. But if we are to be consistent, we must say that what contains others may be uncontained. Nor again, can we say that everything must be somewhere or in some place, since the place in which things are, if anything like a limit of them, may not be in any other place, if as the limit of what is limited by it and the container of what is contained need not have a further limit nor be contained in anything else. Place, then, will not need to be in some yet other place, nor will anything that is have to be in some place. Gorgias, I suppose not. Socrates, neither if being is ungenerated, and so without beginning and unlimited, can we demand that it must be somewhere and in something. For a limit need not be limited by some further limit, nor what contains be contained by something else. And a limit as well as a container, we say is and may be without being within a limit and without being contained by some yet other. So, none shall demand that place must be in something else, nor then that anything that is must be in some place or in something else. Gorgias, according to the argument, Socrates, that follows. Yet I am hesitant, besides for the sake of consistency, to admit the conclusion. Socrates, well, we cannot throw out the conclusion without throwing out the premises which were agreeable. Gorgias, nor would I readily throw out what we agreed to previously. Socrates, then let us consider the subject matter for which these difficulties were raised. Gorgias, yes, the difficulties raised about ungenerated being were that being, if without a beginning and limitless, could not be in anything and could not be anywhere. Socrates, but the premise that anything that is has to be somewhere has been dispelled. Gorgias, somewhat reservedly, yes. Socrates, and that, since the limit of what is limited may be without a limit. Gorgias, right. Socrates, now, being, if ungenerated and without a beginning or limit, would be primarily unlimited in respect of time rather than place. Didn't that become evident to us? Gorgias, more so in respect of time, yes. Socrates, let us then consider time in terms of what we have gathered about the limit, the limited and the unlimited. For time is certainly the limit of anything we say has its beginning in time. and the unlimitedness of being has been considered by us to be in respect of time. Gorgias, certainly. Socrates, then if everything that has come to be is limited and has its beginning in time, time must, being the limit of everything else, itself also have a limit or be unlimited. Is that right? Gorgias, undoubtedly. Socrates, and if time, although the limit of everything that has a beginning and is in time, also has a limit and is in something else, then would not that have to be ungenerated and limitless without a beginning? Or could something that is not in time have a beginning or be generated? Gorgias, if time is limited by something else, whatever that is couldn't have a beginning in time. No. But we said that if being is ungenerated, then it is without a beginning and unlimited. Gorgias, we did. Socrates, then time, having something outside of it, would be limited by being. Gorgias, I suppose. Socrates, but if being is the limit of becoming and time, if being is the limit of becoming and time as a whole, and being outside of time is without beginning or limit, then no absurdity results. Instead, we find that things are limited by a limit, which is itself without limit. And we find that what is unlimited has the relation of a limit to what is limited, but is not reciprocally limited by what it is a limit of. Once more, as before, we found that surfaces are limited by lines, and lines are limited by points, but points are not limited by anything else. And as we found that the end for the sake of which we choose to endure hardships and difficulties is not for the sake of anything else, and so itself has no further end. So also being, if ungenerated and so without a beginning and limit, cannot be in time, but time, which is the limit of everything else that has a beginning, is itself limited by being. We find being to be, while the limit of others, unlimited. Callicles, you have not, Socrates, Callicles, you have not, Socrates, proved that something must exist. Yet you have dispelled the difficulties that Gorgias said would result from the previous hypotheses. Most, if not the rest, of his vast array of arguments that prove that nothing exists remains unsolved. Socrates, can that not always be said in defense of the refutation of an argument which is structured in such a way as to presume that if something exists, such as motion or anything else, one of two contraries must be true, such as that motion must be either continuous or discrete, and then assuming each of them in turn reduces both of the hypotheses to absurdity, leaving the only inference that doesn't result in absurdity to be that the thing in question, for example, motion, doesn't exist. I assume your meaning is that if I were to show that continuous motion, again, for example, does not result in the absurdities which the argument concludes, then that would be insufficient to prove that either motion in general exists or that motion is continuous. I'm going to stop there.